Avoidants fear vulnerability because to them, vulnerability represents danger. It is not just about showing emotion or admitting a mistake. It is about opening the door to rejection, abandonment, or judgment. For many people with avoidant tendencies, this fear is rooted in early experiences where closeness felt unsafe, unreliable, or overwhelming. As adults, they build protective walls by pulling away, shutting down, or refusing to admit fault. When someone expects them to apologize, they feel as though they are being asked to step into an emotional fire without any guarantee that they will not get burned. The apology, in their mind, is not just about the words, "I'm sorry." It is about lowering their guard and admitting that they were wrong, which leaves them exposed. That exposure is exactly what they have spent years trying to avoid. Because of this fear, when avoidants hurt someone, they often do not respond with remorse the way others expect. Instead of rushing to repair the damage, they retreat. They may rationalize their behavior or act as if nothing happened, not because they don't care, but because caring openly feels too risky. Vulnerability requires trust, and if that trust is not deeply established, they will not allow themselves to enter that emotional space. This is why partners, friends, or loved ones often feel frustrated. They interpret the lack of apology as coldness or cruelty, but for the avoidant, it is survival. Their instinct tells them that admitting fault means giving the other person power over them, and so they hold back, hoping to preserve control. What makes this dynamic so difficult is that an apology is not just about words, it is about connection. For most people, saying, "I'm sorry," is a way of repairing the bond, of showing empathy and accountability. But for an avoidant, it feels like tearing down their shield. The vulnerability of apologizing forces them to confront uncomfortable truths, that they hurt someone they care about, that their behavior might push people away, and that they cannot always stay hidden behind detachment. These realizations conflict with the avoidant's protective strategies, making the simple act of saying sorry feel almost unbearable. It is not that they do not want to make things right, it is that the path to making things right feels lined with danger. To understand this fear, imagine asking someone who has been burned by fire to place their hand near the flame again. Even if you promise it will be safe, their body remembers the pain, and their instinct is to recoil. In the same way, avoidants recoil from vulnerability because their emotional history has taught them that closeness leads to hurt. Until they see that being vulnerable will not destroy them, they will continue to resist it. This is why patience, boundaries, and calm strength are essential when dealing with an avoidant. Pushing them, shaming them, or demanding vulnerability only reinforces their fear. What makes the difference is creating a safe environment where openness feels possible, where vulnerability is not punished but respected. When avoidants are gently shown that vulnerability can actually strengthen rather than weaken relationships, they begin to test the waters. Over time, they may learn that apologizing does not make them small, it makes them more human. The act of taking responsibility can deepen trust rather than strip it away. But this shift only happens when the avoidant feels that the person across from them is not trying to exploit their apology, but to genuinely reconnect. Vulnerability becomes less of a threat and more of a bridge. And in that space, the apology they once feared becomes something they can finally offer, not from fear or pressure, but from a place of safety and growth. When we talk about accountability in relationships, especially with people who have avoidant tendencies, the word safety becomes the most important factor. So often we think that if someone hurts us, the only way to get them to admit it is by pushing harder, raising our voice, or demanding the apology we feel we deserve. But when the person we're dealing with has an avoidant style, that pressure almost always backfires. The avoidant doesn't step closer under pressure, they step away. They see accountability not as a bridge to repair, but as a spotlight that exposes them to shame and vulnerability. And for someone who has spent their life learning to retreat in moments of discomfort, shame is the trigger that sends them running. This is why understanding safety is the key to getting to the accountability you want. When an avoidant feels attacked, they go into self-protection. That self-protection can look like silence, withdrawal, defensiveness, or even gaslighting. They'll minimize what happened, they'll change the subject, or they'll act like you're making a big deal out of nothing. And that reaction, while frustrating, comes from a place of fear. To them, Accountability feels like standing in the middle of a battlefield without armor. But what happens if you remove the battlefield altogether? What if instead of fighting for the apology, you step into a calmer energy, one that communicates, I see what happened, I know my worth, and I won't let this pass unnoticed, but I'm not here to destroy you. That's when something changes. The avoidant begins to feel that acknowledging their mistake won't end in punishment, humiliation, or abandonment. Instead, it becomes a step toward connection. Safety in this context doesn't mean excusing their behavior. It doesn't mean staying quiet about the hurt they've caused. It means speaking from a place of groundedness instead of hostility. It means using language that centers on your feelings rather than their faults. Instead of saying, you always shut down, you never care, you never say sorry, you can say, when that happened, I felt dismissed and hurt. I need to feel respected and seen in order to stay close to you. That small shift changes the energy. You're not cornering them, you're opening the door. And avoidants, for all their distance, still crave that door to be open. They may not walk through it right away, but the very presence of safety gives them a reason to consider it. Accountability grows in an environment where fear is lowered and trust is raised. When the avoidant sees that you're not going to weaponize their apology against them, they feel less threatened by the act of giving it. And when they sense that your calm confidence means you'll walk away if they don't step up, they recognize that their behavior has real consequences. That combination of lowered fear and raised consequence is what unlocks accountability. They realize that apologizing isn't an act of surrender, it's an act of repairing the bond. In fact, once they feel safe enough to apologize, they often begin to understand that vulnerability doesn't destroy relationships, it strengthens them. So, the next time you find yourself waiting on an apology from an avoidant, remember that safety is not about coddling them, nor is it about abandoning your needs. It's about creating the conditions where accountability feels possible. By holding your boundaries with dignity and expressing your hurt without aggression, you take away the battlefield they've been trained to fear. And in that moment, accountability can emerge not from force, but from choice. When someone chooses to step into responsibility because they feel safe enough to do so, that apology carries weight. It isn't empty. It isn't dragged out. It's real. And real accountability is the foundation of trust. When you're dealing with someone who has avoidant tendencies, one of the most painful experiences is waiting for an apology that never comes. You might find yourself rehearsing conversations in your head, thinking about how you'll confront them or even sending long messages explaining how much they've hurt you. But here's the truth. Every time you beg for an apology, every time you chase after their accountability, you give away your power and you feed into the very dynamic that keeps you stuck. Avoidants are wired to retreat when they feel pressure. The more you push for them to acknowledge your pain, the more they run from it. That doesn't mean your hurt isn't real. It doesn't mean your feelings don't matter. It simply means that begging for recognition is the wrong strategy if what you actually want is repair and respect. Boundaries are what shift the game. A boundary is not a punishment, it's not a dramatic speech, and it's not an attempt to guilt trip the other person. A boundary is a calm, steady line you draw that says, I will not stay in situations that hurt me, and I will not keep giving my energy to someone who cannot respect me. When you stop begging and instead set a clear boundary, you create a new energy in the relationship. You're no longer dependent on their apology to feel whole. You're standing in your own self-worth, showing that you know what you deserve without having to shout it or plead for it. This shift is magnetic because it communicates both strength and clarity. The avoidant no longer sees someone trying to control them. They see someone confident enough to walk away from disrespect. The difference between boundaries and begging lies in the energy you bring. Begging says, I need you to validate me or else I can't feel okay. Boundaries say, I validate myself and I decide what I will and won't allow. When you show up from this place of inner stability, you create a space where the avoidant is confronted not with your desperation, but with their own behavior. They start to feel the natural consequence of their actions. Not because you're punishing them, but because you refuse to carry the burden of their avoidance anymore. That space is often the exact thing that makes them reflect, feel the loss of connection and consider taking responsibility. This doesn't guarantee an apology every single time, and it shouldn't be the reason you set boundaries. Boundaries are about protecting your peace, not about coaxing someone into doing what you want. But ironically, the very thing that avoids and resists, accountability, becomes possible when you stop pushing and start standing firm. You're no longer the pursuer in the dance. You've stepped back, and in that silence, the avoidant has to meet themselves. That's when the apology has a chance to emerge, not as something you forced, but as something they chose. So the next time you're tempted to send one more text, to explain one more time, to wait just a little longer for them to finally get it, pause. Remind yourself that begging only drains you and reinforces the distance. Instead, take a breath, step back, and draw your line, not out of anger, but out of self-respect. That quiet strength says more than any demand ever could. It tells the avoidant, I am not here to chase you. I am here to be treated with care. And if they want to be in your life, they will feel that truth and rise to meet it. When someone treats us poorly, especially an avoidant who tends to withdraw rather than communicate, our first instinct can often be to demand recognition, to push for an apology, or to insist on an explanation. We want them to see the pain they caused, and we think the only way to prove our worth is to get them to admit they were wrong. But the real shift doesn't happen when we push them. It happens when we stand tall in our dignity. When you hold on to your dignity in moments of conflict, you communicate a deeper truth than any argument or demand could. You show that you know your value and you don't need their apology to validate it. That posture alone begins to shift the dynamic because respect is not earned by begging, it is commanded by the quiet power of self-respect. Imagine you're with someone who avoids conflict. They don't like uncomfortable conversations and they tend to run from accountability. If you meet that avoidance with desperation, chasing them down with questions or accusations, you actually reinforce their fear. You confirm their belief that opening up will only bring chaos or rejection. But when you take a step back, when you show them through your calmness that you won't crumble without their validation, they see something unexpected. They see that you're not trying to control them, you're not trying to punish them. You're simply standing in who you are. That kind of dignity is magnetic because it makes people feel safe enough to let their guard down. Dignity doesn't mean coldness, and it doesn't mean silence for the sake of silence. It means speaking the truth of your hurt without losing control of yourself in the process. You can say, "That really hurt me," in a tone that's steady, without anger, without pleading. You can let someone know that you won't accept mistreatment, not by shouting it, but by embodying it. That energy communicates more powerfully than any demand. And here's the irony: when you let go of needing the apology, you create the exact space where the apology can finally come. Because the avoidant no longer feels like they're about to be destroyed by admitting fault. They start to feel that apologizing won't make them smaller, it will make the connection stronger. This is why dignity always creates respect. It's not about what the other person does or doesn't do in the moment. It's about how you carry yourself regardless of their reaction. You teach people how to treat you by the way you treat yourself. When you show that you have standards, that you won't beg for scraps of affection or attention, you invite the other person to rise to meet you. They may resist at first. Avoidants often do, but the respect you earn by holding steady plants a seed that grows over time. Even if they don't apologize right away, your strength lingers in their mind. They start to see that accountability isn't weakness, it's a path back to you. And eventually, that realization pushes them to do what they once avoided, to apologize with sincerity. So, when you're tempted to fight for the apology, remember that the real battle isn't out there, it's inside you. Every time you choose dignity, you reclaim your power. And in that power lies the respect that changes everything. When we talk about getting someone to apologize, especially someone with avoidant tendencies, it's easy to slip into the mindset of strategy and manipulation. You start thinking, if I act this way, maybe they'll feel guilty. If I say this line, maybe they'll crack and finally admit what they did. But that's a trap, because if your goal is to manipulate, what you're really doing is playing a game that leaves you just as disconnected as the avoidant already is. True strength lies not in forcing an outcome, but in standing firm in who you are and what you deserve without needing to twist anyone's arm. Strength in this context means you recognize your own worth. When someone hurts you and refuses to acknowledge it, you don't crumble or chase. You don't scream louder to be heard. Instead, you calmly show through your actions that you will not remain in a space where your pain is dismissed. You don't have to manipulate them into saying sorry. You simply demonstrate that respect and accountability are non-negotiables in your world. That stance alone often compels the avoidant to pause. Because manipulation fuels fear, but strength invites respect. The difference is subtle but powerful. Manipulation looks like withholding affection just to provoke guilt, or exaggerating your pain to trigger pity. It's about controlling the other person's reaction, making them bend under pressure. Strength, on the other hand, is about clarity. You state what happened, how it impacted you, and what you will and won't accept moving forward. You don't shout, you don't dramatize, you don't threaten. You simply embody self-respect. That's not just more effective. It's more sustainable because it protects your dignity regardless of what the other person chooses to do. An avoidant partner or friend can sense when they are being manipulated, and it pushes them further into retreat. They shut down because the moment feels unsafe, confirming their fear that intimacy is a trap. But when you lead with strength, there is nothing for them to defend against. They may not be comfortable right away, but they no longer feel tricked or ambushed. They see, maybe for the first time, that accountability does not mean annihilation. It means growth. Your strength creates an environment where their apology is not extracted but offered. This is the heart of why strength works and manipulation fails. Manipulation creates a short-term win at the cost of long-term trust. Even if you got the apology, it would ring hollow, born out of pressure, not sincerity. But strength plants the seed for something real, the understanding that they can face their flaws without being shamed, and that they are still safe to reconnect with you. That's when the apology arrives with weight and meaning, not because they were cornered, but because they chose to step forward. So when you think about getting an avoidant to apologize, resist the urge to engineer or script the outcome. Instead, focus on being the person who refuses to shrink in the face of avoidance. Show them through your steadiness that vulnerability is not something to fear. Show them that you value yourself enough not to tolerate dismissal, but also that you don't need to destroy them to feel seen. That blend of self-respect and compassion is where real power lies. Strength, not manipulation, is what transforms avoidance into accountability and silence into an honest, healing "I'm sorry." When someone has hurt you, especially someone with avoidant tendencies, the instinct is often to push them for recognition of what they've done. You want to confront them. You want to make them admit they were wrong. And you want them to give you the words that you believe will bring closure. The problem is, the harder you push for that moment of accountability, the more they retreat. An avoidant person is wired to run from vulnerability, and admitting fault feels like the most vulnerable thing of all. This is why direct pressure so often backfires. Instead of finding remorse, you encounter distance. Instead of hearing an apology, you hear silence. But the paradox here is that the more you step back with grace, the more powerful your influence becomes. Action inspires reflection in ways that words rarely can. When you respond to hurt, not with a desperate plea or angry demand, but with quiet, measured self-respect, you send a message that cannot be ignored. You show that you value yourself enough not to tolerate being treated poorly. You show that you are willing to disengage from a dynamic that diminishes your worth. This withdrawal isn't about punishing them or playing games, it's about centering yourself in dignity. And when the avoidant is faced with your calm strength, they are forced to confront themselves. Suddenly, there is no chaos to hide behind, no conflict to distract from their own actions. Your silence becomes louder than any argument. In that space, reflection is born. An avoidant who expected you to fight, chase, or beg is left with the weight of their choices. They see that you didn't collapse under the pressure of their distance, you rose above it. That contrast often sparks a realization they can no longer pretend their behavior has no consequences. Where words may have been dismissed as nagging or criticism, your action, stepping back with grace, becomes undeniable evidence that something has to change. For perhaps the first time, they feel both the sting of losing your presence and the safety of knowing you are not out to destroy them, just to protect yourself. This is where accountability begins to feel possible. The avoidant learns that apologizing does not have to mean surrendering power or exposing themselves to rejection. They begin to see it as a path to reconnection, a way to repair what their distance damaged. None of this is guaranteed, of course, but the chances of a genuine apology are far greater when it is inspired, not extracted. When someone arrives at remorse on their own, it carries more weight than any words you could have forced out of them. The apology then becomes an act of choice, not compliance, and that makes it meaningful. The beauty of action inspiring reflection is that it shifts the focus back to you. It allows you to reclaim control in a situation where you once felt powerless. Instead of waiting endlessly for an avoidant to validate your pain, you validate yourself through your choices. You no longer stand in the shadow of their silence, you stand firmly in your truth, and whether or not their reflection leads to an apology, you have already won. You have shown yourself that your worth is not defined by someone else's words, but by your own actions. And it is often in that moment of strength that the avoidant finally sees you clearly, perhaps for the first time, and realizes that the only way forward is to face themselves and say the words they once feared, "I'm sorry."